Nothing on the screen. I don't know how you see the. Well, with 1 minute delay, just in time, we managed to get systems going. So thank you very much for your patience and trust in us. My name is Andre Marco. I'm the director of ERCST. My colleague Chiara Cavalera, that is managing this file. Today, it is an event under Chatham House rule, talking about the simplification, omnibus simplification package, preparing the trilogues. Obviously, a lot of important events happened over the last 24 hours. I guess most of you are probably aware by now of the outcome of the council decision. And of course, we also go into another set of discussion of the parliament. But in this case, it is about the omnibus simplification package that was published in February of this year. And that included adjustment to a number of items. Some of them have gone through. But then there is the CSRD and CS3D. These are two elements that have been very contentious. I don't need to tell you that have been politically charged. There has been the feeling that toying with what has been put in place is going to show that the EU is backtracking on its level of ambition and its commitment to the transition, which obviously is something is of concern to all of us. But at the same time, we've seen a very strong push from a number of parties, both inside the EU, but also outside the EU, quite extraordinary. The Secretary of Energy of the United States and I think the Minister of Energy of Qatar, basically saying we will not export energy to Europe if you guys do this. Not something for the soft of heart. It is quite a strong statement in terms of international diplomacy, but also with significant consequences if you take them seriously. I think between these two countries, I think it's like 16% of gas imports in the EU. I may be wrong, but I don't know why that number is stuck in my brain. So this is not a simple matter. The Council adopted this position in June, and the EU rapporteur has published its draft report in June, presented to the Parliament Jury Committee, which is the lead committee on this file. On October 13, the committee adopted this compromise position, which is scheduled for a vote during the November plenary session, which is November 11 and 13. And the goal of this event today is to discuss the draft text of the Council and the Parliament and look at what the amendments proposed are and what they mean in terms of CSRD, CS3D, but what it really means in terms of what the EU stands on these very important matters, because this presents the face of the world, or face of the EU to the world. And for some of you are going and some of you are not going, but I'm going on a plane tomorrow morning to go to Belém. So, I'm not representing the European Union or the Commission or any institution, but I'm European and people will be asking questions. So obviously I'm very, very anxious and very keen to hear the views in this room. So the way we have proposed to carry on this discussion is that Chiara will initially speak to this, and then we have Jørgen Hansen from Hydro, that will be a little bit late, correct? And then Yada from E3G, Pierre Garot from Eurosif, and Beatrice Moro from ECO. So thank you all for being here. I think we had one more speaker from IOGP that I think has just excused herself about 10 minutes before the meeting. We present the excuses on behalf of IOGP. So, Chiara?
Thank you very much, Andre, for this introduction and for giving me the floor. So I'm going to go through this presentation to set the scene for the discussion after. So as we all know, in its 2025 work program, the European Commission unveiled a set of initiatives that aims at tackling duplicative and excessive regulations that hinder businesses in the EU. And these efforts are part of the broader vision of the competitiveness compass, which sets the direction for enhancing EU competitiveness and fostering a more prosperous economy. Through these efforts, the Commission wants to cut administrative burdens by 25% overall and by 35% for small and medium-sized enterprises. In February, the Commission published the Omnibus simplification package, and as Andre mentioned, the Council found its negotiation position on CSRD and CSDDD on June 23rd, and an agreement has been reached in the jury committee as well. So when it comes to the three different positions of the Commission, of the Council, and the Parliament for CSRD, we can see that when it comes to the scope, the three proposals are pretty aligned on 1,000 employees, and they differ when it comes to the turnover worldwide. The European Commission suggests 50 million turnover or 25 million assets, while the Council and the Parliament 450 million turnover. The sector-specific EU sustainability reporting standards, the three institutions seems agreeing on deleting these sector-specific standards, with the exception of the Parliament that suggests the development of voluntary sector-specific standards. These three institutions seems aligning on a cap on information requests tied to medium-sized enterprise and small and medium-sized enterprises. And in CSRD, the transition plans according to the Commission, are required to be adopted, but the implementation is no longer mandatory. While the Council replaces compatibility with Paris Agreement with contribution to the Paris Agreement. Let's move now to the CSDDD. So we can see that while the Commission proposal doesn't suggest changes to the scope, which means that it wants to keep it to 1,000 employees, the Council and the Parliament raise the threshold to 5,000 employees. The due diligence scope for the Commission should be limited to the company's own operation, those of their subsidiaries and tier 1 suppliers, which means direct business partners. And the reporting obligation further down the supply chain are required only if the company has plausible information about adverse impacts. And the duty to terminate the business relationship is removed in case of these actual and potential adverse impacts. The Council aligns on tier 1 and introduces a risk-based approach. And only in case of objective and verifiable information on direct partners, the company must extend the risk assessment. The European Parliament still focus on tier 1 only, and the risk-based approach is introduced with stricter restriction on information requests. The civil liability is removed by all three texts, and the European Parliament adds a review clause to reassess this approach in 5 years. Then the European Commission proposals clarifies also the meaningful engagement with stakeholders and limits it to the relevant ones. And finally, for the climate transition plans, the European Commission supports the adoption of a plan, but it is no longer required to be put into effect. The adoption includes plans and described actions planned and taken, and the compatibility to the European climate law and the Paris Agreement should be ensured through best efforts. The Council position keeps an obligation to adopt, again with no reference to be put into effect. aligns with the Commission on best efforts to be understood as an obligation of means, and the adoption of such transition plans is postponed by 2 years. Finally, the European Parliament keeps the obligation to adopt a plan but deletes implementing actions, and this should happen through reasonable effort instead of best efforts. So an obligation of means again. So the key issues for consideration when it comes to the Omnibus package is first of all that the European Union has enacted extensive regulations and constraints to meet its own ambitious climate targets and to align its framework with the European climate law. These measures, however, should rely on a market-based and technology-neutral approach that encourage innovation and entrepreneurship. Then simplification. While this simplification is the central aim of the Omnibus package, the concept remains vague and is also open to different and multiple interpretations. Its meaning can vary from small procedural tweaks to eliminating major reporting requirements. It is essential that simplification brings about a meaningful change by tackling inefficiencies rather than just relying on superficial adjustments. Then extraterritoriality. We know that this CSRD and CSDDD has an extraterritorial impact, and greater clarity is needed to ensure that the cross-border obligations are coherent and also consistent with international law. And last point, the Paris Agreement and the transition plans. The Paris Agreement is an international treaty that binds the parties, which are sovereign states, to collective climate action, and its primary goals, among which reaching net zero emission and achieving temperature targets, are intended as global objectives to be pursued through coordinated efforts at the national level. So disaggregating these targets to individual enterprises with the transition plans risks undermining the spirit of the agreement, and it can also create burdens to private enterprises. So finally, the next steps, we will have a vote on the Omnibus package on the 13th of November, and then after November, the trilogues are supposed to start. The earliest possible adoption date is end of 2025, but the discussion can shift to beginning 2026. And once the text is going to be approved, the member states that have already transposed the CSRD and the CSDD will need to amend their implementation within 12 months after the text comes into force. So thank you very much for your attention, and I give back the floor to Andre.
Thank you, Chiara. I think that lays out to you, for some of you that know this stuff very well, probably it's old hat. For some of you that probably needed a brushing up, this is, I think, provides a nice summary of where we are. It's obviously a very politically charged discussion and politically charged decision. First of all, because you have something in place that you're amending after a very short time, there's no doubt about that. There are appearances of backtracking in some cases, but at the same time, there have been consistent voices that have been raising caution with respect to implementing this. And in the end, it is a new step that was introduced with CSRD, CS3D, but it is a political decision. And what the political decisions are not necessarily steeped in always in logic, are steeped in political considerations and balances and compromises. And we saw that very well in the decision of the council last night or this morning. So yes, there are issues that Chiara has mentioned, and some of them, will be seen as relevant by some, and some of them will be seen as very relevant by others. Extraterritoriality, some people will see it as a very important matter. The alignment of Paris Agreement, does that make sense, or this is something that we have to do it and we have to do it. So there will be different views, and that those views will be driven by the mind and the heart, to be quite blunt about it. So what we have tried to put two questions to people. We've tried to get folks from the European institutions, but as you will imagine, there is some level of reluctance at this point to engage in public. These are very sensitive matters. So we tried really hard, but it is what it is. So the three questions that we do is, how will the different negotiating position of Commission, Council, and Parliament play out? What's your sense where this is going? And whatever you can share in your thoughts on your information, what additional improvement will be proposed to the Omnibus text bill? And what are the main challenges associated with the climate transition plan under the proposed amendments? The climate transition plan seems to be real. I mean, the way I understood it is that the civil liability was clearly an issue. The climate transition plan seems to be quite an issue. And I was, reading articles after articles after articles in DFT and other publications on this topic, with people making strong points on that. So Jürgen Hansen will put him at the end because he is being late. So Yuri Yada from E3G, you start. Good to see you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Andre, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yuri Yada, Director and the Head of EU Sustainable Finance at E3G. We're an independent, non-aligned think tank specializing in the political economy of climate change. So indeed, it is a day where there's a lot happening. So I think this couldn't be more timely. So thank you for the invitation. And I think by way of trying to understand and assess not only what is in the different proposals and in the amendments for the CSRD and the CSDDD that we have on the table, and also while trying to understand if these are fit for purpose for the goal of actually achieving the competitiveness of European businesses of all sizes and of the European economy that we want. I want to first take a bit of a step back to ask a fundamental question, which I think is this: what is supporting European competitiveness? What does this look like as an outcome? And then on the back of that, do these proposals match up to this reality? Do they hinder or help the achievement of these ambitions? And I think there are three aspects that I wanted to unpack with you here today to try to answer this question and to evaluate the proposals we have on the table. The first is, I think, ultimately, if all goes well, competitiveness means very simply that there will be more investments in European companies. And going to European businesses of all sizes. I'm very much simplifying some of this, but I think that we can agree on. The second would be that European businesses have an edge over American, over Chinese, or over global competitors. Again, I'm deliberately keeping this broad. What edge? There are all sorts of questions attached to that, but I think that's the second one. And the third would be that the European businesses we have here are both resilient and future-proof, and so are resistant to any type of disruptions, that they can maintain these edges, maintain these advantages into the economy that we have today, but also into the future. Now, when I look at these three aspects and I look at what is also in the text here, I think the question is, again, what are we helping or hindering the aim of and achievement of these three elements with the different proposals on the table? And it's way too big a question for us to answer in our think tank. So we actually went to the source. We asked businesses, over 2,500 business leaders from many different member states. So we focused on 5: Italy, Spain, France, Germany, and Poland, and asked leaders from all sorts of sizes of companies. So those from under 250 employees all the way to over 1,000. And based on their answers, I think we're starting to get some elements of what is the feeling in the markets among these businesses themselves on what they hope to see to be the outcome of this, and what we can take based on that on board into the trilogues, if there's, as Andre was saying, both political room, but also perhaps the possibility for calls for changes to the positions we've seen to date. So on the first one, more investments going into European businesses of all sizes. a really striking finding from the survey, which was run by YouGov, so we commissioned an independent pollster to do this, was that an overwhelming majority of companies of all sizes from all of these countries surveyed thought that sustainability reporting under the CSRD actually helps attract investment. They thought this was something that would give them more access to investments into their businesses. So this is over 50% of businesses across the country surveyed to support that, and only under 20% were against this. So I think we are seeing that there's a notion of opportunity linked with reporting that sometimes may not fully be captured in some of the debates we see. Another finding, which was quite striking for us, given some of these discussions, was that the overwhelmingly preferred option for the threshold for the scope of CSRD was 250. And these are smaller businesses and also mid to large companies, overwhelmingly saying they want to be in the scope of the regulation. So this raised a question for us, which was, how are these inputs being taken into account? And also, this does then solidify the perception that they see this as a competitive advantage. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, I think there's also in the discussions around, are we going far enough in the changes, a question of policy stability and policy certainty for businesses. And I think for us, we want to make sure that we listen and we support businesses to the extent possible. I think we're all on board of making life easier for them. But I think if we start shaking things up too much, maybe listening to certain political pressures that Andre was signaling earlier, we may end up with an opposite signal, which is this is not a safe jurisdiction for investment because we don't have policy certainty. And I think we see the costs of this across the Atlantic in the US already, because for the first time in the 15 years that one MSI tracker has been looking at this, we're seeing US green and climate funds losing out investments in favor of European and Asian funds. So I think if we want to make sure that we continue being a safe haven for investments, we need to be considering some of these aspects as well. And last but not least, on this first point, I think to complement some of these findings from the survey, this is also the robustness of our rules. I think some of it lately under attack from other jurisdictions is really also something that can create opportunity investments and attract foreign funds into the EU. What do I mean by that? So I think we saw in the summer that there are a number of major sovereign wealth funds and also pension funds directly removing fund management from US fund managers because they didn't feel they complied sufficiently or had robust enough standards for sustainability. And they put those, in some cases, those funds and those mandates with European investments, with hopefully the potential that they go then to European companies. So when we look at increasing the investments for European companies, I think simplification might also be missing some of the nuances that are there amongst the companies and what they want and what investors want in the environment. On the second point of European businesses having an edge over American and Chinese competitors, this was quite interesting. We saw that in our survey, overwhelmingly, the businesses surveyed felt that having robust environmental and social rules in Europe would give us an advantage over Chinese and American competitors. Looking a bit under the surface of this, in particular on strong due diligence, they felt that these rules would give the advantage to European companies in different supply chains because it would be easier and it would be easier to ensure that they're complying with stringent rules. And so if we look at that and we also look at the overwhelming number of businesses who are saying that they would want to the Europe to continue leading on sustainability, this is over 60% of the respondents, I think we're getting a picture that is slightly at odds with what sometimes might seem a bit of a reactive approach with the Omnibus, scaling back, kind of letting go of some of the areas where Europe was leading, not for the sake of leading, but because the businesses that we're trying to make this work for think that this is an advantage. So I think that is worth noting. And there's a question here, are we striking the right balance in these texts? Last but not least, on getting to resilient and future-proof business models, over 55% of the respondents compared with just 20% said sustainability is competitiveness, is the future. So anything that can help support them with the transition towards sustainability is what they consider in their own interest in the long term. Over 60% of the business leaders supported, among other things, the requirement to implement transition plans. This is across the board, across all the companies surveyed, but in particular large companies, this was seen as a tool that could help them attract investments, but also mitigate some of the risks in navigating into a low carbon economy. And this number, interestingly, was highest in Italy. 75% of respondents there supported mandatory implementation of transition plans for large companies, and 71% in France. And the numbers stay high consistently across the different countries we surveyed. So here again, I think we're hearing from the market that these tools can be useful. Just to give you another number to chew on, the International Transition Plan Network today launched a series of papers showing the market case for transition plans. And one of the numbers that they cite is that 79% of investors find it an obstacle if a company doesn't have a transition plan to invest in that company. So again, let us listen to the numbers because they tell us something. They tell us the desire for certainty, for the opportunity to be able to use the tools that we have developed in Europe that have led the way to others emulating some of our approaches. And I think understanding that on that basis for what makes us competitive will allow us to judge whether we're getting the CSDDD and the CSRD right. And I think indeed there are political interests at play, but I think we do not want to send a signal that we are giving into pressure, that we're giving into weakness, but instead this is our way of trying to give confidence to businesses and to investors in the EU. And I think that there is a margin here where we can get that right. And I'm hoping that can actually support ultimately the competitiveness we want.
Let's go without further ado, Pierre Garot, and then Beatrice.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So Pierre Garot, Senior Policy Advisor at Eurosif, the European Sustainable Investment Forum. So maybe a few words on what we are at Eurosif and what we do. So we represent at the European level our national members, sustainable investment forums that are working with the financial industry, so asset owners, asset managers, service providers to establish best practices and make policy recommendations that are conducive to developing sustainable investment. So we carry this mission at the European level. And as such, we are pretty big supporters of CSRD and CSDDD, which in our opinion are cornerstone of the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. And why? Because they provide investors with the sustainability data and information that they need on their day-to-day activity. So we know that in recent years, ESG risks and opportunity have been more and more incorporated by investors. They are increasingly material to investment decision making. A few days ago, MSCI published a study showing that portfolios from large asset owners internationally were at 55% exposed to companies with acute physical risks. So that means potentially loss of a wide amount of value. We know that the clients of investors are also increasingly showing appetite for sustainable investing, especially asset owners, and investors need sustainability data as well, just to comply with their own regulatory requirements, so SFDR and Pillar 3, to name a few. So in that regard, the investor community was not necessarily enthusiastic about reopening those rules. And in February, we published a joint statement in collaboration with UNPRI and IGCC, asking jointly with 200 investors representing 6.6 trillion assets under management to limit the changes to a maximum, because as Jure just mentioned, this creates major regulatory uncertainty for the investing community. And we believe that these changes and this simplification, which we acknowledge is in some instance necessary, could have been achieved on a more technical level. So we are now where we are. The Omnibus initiative was indeed published, and we see some clear position from the Council side, some maybe less clear positions on the European Parliament side. So just in terms of our general opinions on where things stands right now, so and where the Omnibus initiative is probably going in terms of finalized text. So an additional reduction in scope, even from the initial Commission proposal. What does that mean for investors? That means more difficult access to reliable and standardized ESG data. That means less incentive for investors to provide finance to those companies that would be out of that scope. We do acknowledge that, so the Council proposal in particular mitigated some of our concerns around that, but we still feel that a 90% reduction in scope compared to the initial CSRD is fairly significant. We also see the value chain cap in CSRD being maintained in probably both proposals, which create there again some uncertainty for investors. Concretely, it would be extremely difficult to differentiate between information that is required for investing purposes and for reporting purposes. So we do understand that it's not the intention of co-legislators to establish the barrier for investments, but it may create some very concrete operational issues for investors. Our concerns also relates to what is happening to those companies that would not be in the scope of CSRD. So we understand that the Commission suggests and the Council suggests that voluntary reporting could help according to the VSME standard. We do not believe that the VSME standard is a tool that is fit for purpose for larger companies, companies larger than SMEs. That probably will end up in investors then again getting access to less information, and if it is disclosed against the VSME, information will be less comparable and less reliable. On the risk-based due diligence, we do appreciate that the risk-based approach was reverted and reintroduced in the Council proposal. That would be a good way for investors to have a clearer picture of the risks that companies are exposed to across their value chain. And then again, climate transition plans being maintained, at least in terms of adoption, is for us a good news. We published a study 2 years ago now showing that forward-looking informations were among the type of data that was the most requested by investors and fairly difficult to access. Climate transition plans in particular are an essential tool for investors to make informed investment decisions. So speaking now about the European Parliament, there again, we don't exactly know where things are exactly going. We did not, well, we believe that the compromise text that was issued by the jury text was presented some improvement compared to some of the initial proposals that we heard during the negotiations in terms of scope, in terms of transition plans as well. We did also welcome the reintroduction of sector-specific guidance, which was a pretty good step forward, and we do hope that it will be maintained in the final text. So what do we want now for first the European Parliament position and then the final text? We would very much like the core provisions of the CSRD and the CSDDD to be maintained. A scope that is in line with the Council proposal would seem a good compromise. Transition plans, adoptions and implementation would be a very good step forward and very helpful for investors. And the risk-based due diligence approach would be also very, very important. And we are not the only ones supporting this. So in September, we issued a joint investor and business statement that was signed by 480 companies, that was also coordinated by some of the organizations that I see in this room and in this panel, where large investors, large real economy companies did support explicitly to maintain those core aspects in the final text of the Omnibus. Then again, showing that, as Jure said, these rules are actually delivering already in practice. What we would like from our investor perspective to be addressed as well in the upcoming discussions is the value chain cap that I just mentioned, bringing additional clarification on the exact scope of the value chain cap and what information it exactly entails, and also see something more detailed being proposed on the voluntary reporting of companies that will not be in scope of CSRD. We recently also published a joint statement with UNPRI and EFAMA asking for the establishment of a credible voluntary standards that would be comparable with the revised DSRS, which we believe has been already significantly simplified. And we would like to establish a subset of the simplified DSRS to ensure that investors have access to comparable, credible information and can actually finance those companies, and also deliver on the clean industrial deal objectives.
Thank you. Very clear and very to the object. Beatrice, and then I see that Jürgen has joined us online, but we'll give him a few moments. Jürgen, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but let Beatrice go and then we'll come back to you, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having me here. Can you hear me well? Yes. Okay. I'm Beatrice Moro, and I'm a senior policy advisor at ECHO. ECHO is a think tank that is based in Italy, and he deals just with climate change and energy transitions matter. I work in the finance team, specifically in the sustainable finance part. So I will use these 5 minutes, thank you for having me here, to talk about the small and medium enterprises perspectives on the Omnibus regulation, on the Omnibus proposals. Why I'm talking about that? Because although SMEs are generally not subject to the mandatory reporting requirements, they are not in scope of CSRD and CSDDD since the beginning, also before of Omnibus, they are indirectly affected. First of all, because they are in the value chain of the bigger suppliers that fall into the scope of CSRD and CSDDD. And second of all, because they receive financing from big investors, big banks, as Pierre was saying. So they are affected indirectly. The second reason why I'm talking about SMEs today is because they represent, and these aren't my data, these aren't data coming from the European Commission, they represent 50% of the European GDP and the 63% of corporate greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, they are already out of the scope, but they are affected. And there's a reason why they are affected, because big companies, big financial institutions are constantly asking to them to provide data, to provide proofs of their sustainability performance. In Italy, these data are actually bigger because we have an economic texture extremely characterized by SMEs. The 75% of the added value of Italy comes from SMEs. And what is their position? And I'm speaking on behalf of some Italian SMEs associations with which during this year of negotiation around the Omnibus, we have helped them to develop their own position on the matter. So they feel that Omnibus is leaving them behind, and they don't see that removing or weakening these rules actually help them, but leaves them unsupported with unharmonized and uncomparable reporting. This will, of course, increase their costs, transaction costs, and also increase their fragmentation informations. I would like to take 1 minute just to reflect on the rationale behind this position. The point was actually clearly mentioned by Pierre. I'm basically talking about the other side of the deals, you know. So besides talking about sustainable finance, climate finance, SMEs actually continue to face a restrictive financial environment. That is basically because of high interest rates. They need to always to provide collaterals, guarantees. They are affected by inflation, of course, and economic uncertainty. They are the worst that they face economic uncertainty. But this is actually worse if we see the sustainable finance and climate finance part, because of course, in a world where climate finance and sustainable instruments for financing, of course, is expanding, is increasing, they have to prove, they have to be able to provide data to big investors, to big banks, commercial banks, on ESG issues, okay? Just to access finance, okay? If they are not supported in developing reports, in developing transition plans to provide big investors and banks the information that they need to access to this finance, then we have a problem. Then we will have a problem of competitiveness for our own industries, as Jure was saying. So what basically they need is not a matter of weakening these reports to help them to deal with CSRD and CSDDD, but actually provide support, okay, that goes beyond reporting requirements. We are talking about capacity building. We're talking about policies that helps them to really improve their management system, or I don't know, training courses, or I don't know, common software that really helps them to provide those data. So beside this, that goes a little bit beyond, of course, the Omnibus regulation, but was the main point. One point that was raised by Pierre is actually very central for them, because they know that even if we set a value chain cap, they will continue to receive information from investors that goes, again, beyond the reporting requirements, because banks need to have those data to manage their own investment risks, their own economic and finance climate-related risks, okay? So it's not a matter of value chain cap for them. It's a matter of really help them to improve their capabilities on dealing with reporting, dealing with transition plans, and actually put into effect these tools. So yes, I do agree the SME standard is actually a little bit weak for them, because it was developed and prepared by EFRAG for companies with less than 250 employees, but now we are trying to apply it to very big firms, like less than 1,000 employees. So it's a bit unbalanced for them. But the point here is the legal uncertainty for them that's the main point. And I do agree also on the transition plans requirement, because they are continually, I'm talking again for the SMEs, they're continually receiving requests of transition plans from the big investors, from also the supervisory authorities. Okay, I think we have all in mind the great actually, European Central Bank positions in May. There it was very, very clear that transition plans is seen now as the main tool to manage, assess and manage climate-related risks, okay? So I do believe those investors, the 75% of investors in Italy, that they believe that yes, we want to see transition plans, we want to adopt transition plans, because it is a tool that really helps us to access to finance and to manage our climate-related risks. So again, is a tool that is really, really important to have also a forward-looking information to really deal with climate issues. So they know, SMEs know, that they must be prepared, they must have a transition plans to access to finance. So they want actually standardized tools, standardized guidelines, standardized requirements to actually deal with it. I think I stop here for the moment.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you.
I'll go to now back to Jürgen. Jürgen, we can hear you. You can hear us. You've heard, I think you caught not all the interventions, but probably quite a few of them. So you have the floor now, and then we'll go in and have a conversation with the room. Actually, I'm encouraging, the room is quite full, and we're encouraging the conversation in the room and with the people on the screen. But first of all, Jürgen.
So first of all, thanks for having me. I'm sorry for being a little bit late, but there are certain strategic processes running in a hydro, so I had to be somewhere else. But really grateful for being here. Should be there physically, but online is better than nothing. So just a little brief introduction of Hydro. We're a globally integrated aluminum producing company with approximately 32,000 employees spread around 36 countries globally. So obviously, one of our key markets and places is Europe. We are present in 18 EU member states and have approximately 13,000 of our employees there. So what happens in the EU is obviously very important for us, and we take a great interest in trying to navigate these things. From the perspective of the CSRD and the CSDDD, by extension also the taxonomy, I guess, we're a globally vertically integrated company. We have a very long value chain, which also means that we have a lot of broad and practical experience in due diligence, both for our own operations, our sites, and for selected areas also in local communities. And we have more or less been using the UNDP since its inception in 2011. And are committed and bound by the OECD guidelines even longer. In addition, as some of you probably know, being a big company, we have first-hand experience implementing due diligence legislation. We are covered by the German law. There is a less-known Norwegian law, which is called the Transparency Act of all things, but it isn't, practice human rights due diligence law with extensive reporting requirements publicly available. And we have the French law, we have Australian law, we have, bits and pieces all over the place. And in terms of the Norwegian law, because you know that we're not an SME, but the Norwegian Transparency Act is actually mandatory for any company with more than 50 FTEs or the equivalence of, or 7 million euros in revenue. So it has a very broad scope, and maybe it could be interesting for you to have a look at a KPMG report that was published earlier this year, where a broad majority of these SME companies says that they appreciate this due diligence law, and it isn't really that hard for them to have a risk-based approach towards their supplier base. Because I think it's important to emphasize that for the vast majority of the European-based companies that is not very international, the risk is rather moderate in terms of your supply chain, because you typically have companies such as Hydro as your tier 1 supplier. And if Hydro is covered by the law, we will run the necessary due diligence and you can basically stop your process there. So from where we come, we think it's, we were for sort of, our position was initially that the CSDDD especially should be left outside the Omnibus process as such, because we felt that a lot of the work that needed to be done for clarification was better left to the guidelines processes. But of course, we all know that that didn't happen. And then what happened with the rejection of the compromise position a few weeks ago, we at least believe as a global company has prolonged an uncertainty around thresholds and timelines that is quite, complicated and confusing for us. And I think at least for Hydro's perspective, if we prolong this process, that could be even more damaging than agreeing on some sort of common denominator, leaving perhaps the most controversial elements. You can kick that can down a little bit, but I think just agreeing on a platform would be hugely beneficial for all the companies that probably are in scope. And I think for the majority of the companies that are in scope, they are already doing this more or less the standardized UNGP/OECD way already, simply due to national or international legislation and expectations in the different industries. Because when we don't know what we have to relate to, we constantly keep repeating and revising our compliance systems. It increases cost. It creates, a diversion of resources. You get a fatigue internally in the organization as well. And of course, it means that we know that the intention of these processes are obviously to try to simplify regulation, but any type of multi-stakeholder dialogue frequently will result in, maybe unintendedly so, the quite the opposite, because if you change a wording somewhere else, it's almost like a whack-a-mole, something pops up elsewhere. So ongoing revisions also, in addition to usually creating unintended complications, erode a little bit of confidence in the final legislation as such. And I think it's important that even if nobody's really happy with the final outcome, the legitimacy of what we end up with is more important. Our experience since 2011 tells us that this is an ongoing process. Nobody really knows what's the best solution anyway. So I think we should try to, or at least for Hydro's perspective, it's much better to have something that is agreed upon, and then we can start working with that at the core, and then we can carve out all of these different bits and pieces that are more complicated to agree upon. But I'm not sure further discussions from the legislative elements is the right place to have that process running. Obviously, of course, we're speaking from a position where we have a multitude of legal frameworks to relate to. And again, I'm pretty sure this cuts for most of the big European companies as well. That is a suboptimal situation. An EU regulation will probably quickly see that all the national legislations on this, and I mean, the Germans have already, or Germany has already signaled that their Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz will be aligned with the CSDDD. And, you know, one way of putting it for us is like, whatever the CSDDD becomes, the benefit of having an EU regulation is that will probably trump all national legislation. So you get a level playing field, aka much easier for everybody to relate to, and you also reduce expectation gaps between all the different stakeholders. Even if they're not happy with what they have, the legitimacy of that is a very powerful force. So we, for us at least, think it will be hugely beneficial if the Parliament could take steps to secure a credible and sound compromise, even though you can't make everybody happy, and you protect the key standards and norm already achieved, you know, referring to the basic risk-based approach. And like the INTA suggestion from the discussions in the Parliament was, as far as I understood, it needs to be an element of tier agnostic on this one, because everybody knows that tier 1 is not where the risk is. The risk is at your mine, at your farm, or at your plantation. So if you only can dig for tier 1, especially for, you know, the fairly midstream and downstream entities operating in Europe, you lose a little bit of the intention of the law, which I guess at least partially is to assure that whatever product or service ends up at the customer side has some sort of standard all the way across the value chain. And this has been done already and been doing already, and it works. I mean, it's not perfect, but I don't think we should be too scared about a risk-based approach that's tier agnostic. So for us, at least, we think that the focus, if we can shift it from, you know, agreeing on a perfect directive, which we'll never will get, I mean, it's going to take a lot of time at least, shift towards settling on a compromise, and then spend more time and resources on the implementation guideline and secondary legislation, which I think is a better area to provide the needed clarity and reduce further uncertainty. And of course, crucially, further delays in adopting anything will probably erode both efficiency and legitimacy, and it is a very tiring process for companies such as us. We prefer to know what to deal with. I think that's the most important part. Is almost secondary what we deal with, as long as everybody else has to deal with the same things. Now, in terms of the omnibus text as such, you know, I think I'll keep that on a high level. It is not uncommon, but for us at least, I mean, it's not only the different EU legislations that does this, but every time new words are introduced trying to mean the same that's already there, creates a lot of work in our legal department. So if we can stick to the OECD guidelines as a reference point, and obviously the UNGP, and try to line the wording as much as possible, especially on the due diligence part, that's really nice. In terms of the CSRD, you know, if you have the materiality principle, and as long as that is drilling down all the way through to the indicators, you leave the companies that are in scope, and also by extension, the companies indirectly influenced by this, with a great degree of flexibility in terms of where they want to spend their limited resources. You know, basically, if we can say that, yeah, this is a suggested indicator in the CSRD, but the resources needed to provide this type of data, which is not material for the decision support with our stakeholders, we find are too big, so we will not report on this sub-indicator, for example. That's more than enough for us. We don't, I mean, that's the standard approach in terms of reporting, and if that can be clarified, that's very great. Like I said, limiting due diligence requirement to a sort of cap on tier 1 will probably remove the main purpose of having any type of due diligence requirements or due diligence law. So I would strongly advise against putting that into something that tier 1 can shield themselves behind. I mean, just to give you an example, how we work today is that if we don't get the information from tier 1 and it's a critical or high risk commodity, for example, we go directly to tier 2, tier 3, or tier 4 ourselves to make sure that, you know, we get what we need. In terms of, you know, putting some sort of information, what we can ask about, that's super. I'm pretty sure that our suppliers will comply with what we're asking anyway. I mean, this is also a commercial decision. and probably should be. I mean, I understand and I respect the fact that sometimes both small companies and big companies are being carpet bombed with very strange questions. So guidance is important, but some sort of legal limitation on what you should ask about is probably a dead-end street, since we will likely get the information we need anyway. Of course, any type of thresholds introduced by the EU as to this is enough in terms of due diligence expectations is mostly welcome, but the world is usually a case-by-case basis on these things. So we will probably have to carve out that ourselves. In short, we like the INTA committee's position, especially on Article 8. So if we can keep some sort of skeleton frame on that, I hope and believe that could be a joint platform to build the rest on it on. And when you move into the climate transitions and liabilities and things like that, you can kick that can down the road a little bit if that is important, but keep the risk-based approach, keep the tier agnostic part, and I'm pretty sure that we can carve out something that makes us both competitive and more sustainable than we are today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Now I'm turning to those that are in the room, and obviously we heard position. They seem to be into violent agreement with each other. Any other views that we can hear? Because it is nevertheless, look, this is supposed, ERCST likes to have a debate. And to be quite blunt about it, there doesn't seem to be much of a debate. But still, there's somebody who doesn't like this. I mean, I tell you what, I've been flying and traveling the world all my life, and over the last year or so, I've been traveling, and in all my travels, I run into one person who about to have voted for Donald Trump. Now, on the other hand, it's about 100 million Americans who did that. So where are the other 909, blah, 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 blah. So where are the people that seem to have a problem with this? Because there's obviously somebody who has a problem with this, or else it wouldn't be in the front of the parliament and we wouldn't have people arguing and so on. So is anybody in this room that have a different view? Because that would be a very, or on the telly, as the Brits would say, on the Zoom. Is there anybody else, anyone that has a different view? But if you don't have a different view, please express views that are yours in whether they're also in agreement or not. But obviously, I'd like to understand if people are having problem with this, why are they having problem, or else we're not having much of a debate. It's also violent silence. Okay, and nevertheless, obviously there are companies, and both European. We're not going to name them because I'm not here representing anybody, but we've heard companies that have been loud and clear, both American, U.S., European, Japanese, that have serious problem, but they seem to be, for some reason, shy to talk about it. And if we don't understand what the problem is, how can we address, if they have any valid concerns, what are the valid concerns? But again, I'm not here to represent them in any way. I'm just trying to stir the pot, but I'm not doing a very good job in that. Anyone, yeah, go ahead, please. Are you violently agreement or in disagreement?
Press.
Otherwise, people on the screen will not.
Oh, that would be a shame. Just a question. It seems that Parliament would lean to the approach that was previously discussed with Patriots and ECR and ESN. What would your reaction be on that if that's going to happen? Like hearing your voicing before.
If you can tell us who you are, it would be helpful.
Well, I'm a representative of the Deutsche Bundesbank, but just speaking about information I just obtained. So it's not my view or it's not the view of the Bundesbank, but just a question into the room on the situation as it seems to be cut out now.
No, it's just for people to, I mean, it's only fair for people to know who it is. It is under Chatham House rule. It's quite clear. We said that from the very beginning. I hope we never had people not respecting that. So we hope people respect that. Anyone else? I'm looking on the screen if there's anybody on the screen that would like to raise their hand and intervene. It looks like one of those topics that people are feeling very, very strongly about, but they're very shy to talk about. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I actually, I work for ECHO together with Beatrice, so I'm not going to express my view because I think you got it much better from her. But I had a question. I wanted to ask maybe to Pierre, but to all of you, what's the difference between the data asked for like investing purposes and the data asked from reporting purposes, and why are they different? Why should they be different? And yeah, and also, I mean, Beatrice talks explicitly about SMEs. I wonder if this is the same for big companies and SMEs, or it's different. Thank you.
You, but okay, I'd like to take a couple of more, if there are a couple of more, before we go to our esteemed panelists. Okay, let's give them some time maybe to gather courage. Do you want to start, Jerry?
Yeah, sure. I'll probably pick up on your question with regards to what our thoughts around potential outcomes from the parliament. Maybe Pierre, if you want to take one on the data, but just to kind of respond to Andre's comments on, you know, there seems to be a certain consensus, and I have to say that I do love a good debate myself, and I have been waiting for a very meaningful discussion on to have a really engaged conversation that can help me understand why are we seeing some of the positions that are being floated right now in the text, and what is the rationale? Is there actually a good idea and a good argument behind them? And I think it's quite telling in this process that actually many we have talked to, not just because we work specialized on the political economy of climate change, I have yet failed to really come across a very convincing position on why we're moving towards the direction we're going in these texts. And I'm taking up the invitation that this is a Chatham House discussion to be quite candid about this. I think that what we're hearing from a lot of companies that we've had the privilege of talking to ourselves, but also through means like the survey that I mentioned earlier, there seems to be a general feeling that their views are not reflected, that somehow the debate that we're having is not really contoured on around the concerns that Jürgen and others have been voicing here. And I think this is a bit of a shame because it begs the question, are we adopting the right approach to competitiveness? I asked the question earlier in my intervention, but one thing that I didn't mention is that in the survey, we asked companies to rank 13 measures in order of what they consider to be, in their view, most relevant, important for them to be competitive. 13 different measures, from addressing electricity prices to investing in innovation, et cetera. Simplifying, potentially deregulating due diligence was bottom of the list. And only 2 up was addressing sustainability reporting. They feel this is the least impactful measure of all 13 options that they were given to improve competitiveness. So I think this does kind of raise the specter of what was being mentioned in the introduction around, I think, the political backdrop of all of this. And I think this brings me to your question on what happens if there is a compromise between the EPP and those on the far right. I think this would send the wrong signals, absolutely, with regards to the credibility and the legitimacy of what we hope to found some of the rules going forward for Europe. I think one thing that I very much agree with that Jürgen, you were saying, is that this uncertainty is costing, but I think I would beg to differ that anything is better than nothing is probably not, by my view. And I think it would create a lot of negative impacts on both the possibility of European businesses to try to see some of the advantage, to really have a level playing field, to really understand that the competitiveness aspect lies also in the sustainability and in making sure that they have the right information to deal with it. I feel like having a outcome that will ultimately show that matters less than some more short-term political bargaining, I think will be detrimental, not just to the outcome of this legislation, but to the wider credibility of what we're trying to achieve. But I'll stop there, but I think it's difficult to speculate on what we may or may not see out of the European Parliament, but if that were to be the outcome, those would be some of the thoughts I'd have.
Thank you. And you want to take on this too?
Sure. So maybe one comment before responding on the data issue, and that's how did we end up here? And I think one of the issue is the speed of the entire process. Like we first heard of the Omnibus in November, and now we almost have a finalized text. It's incredibly fast. And more importantly, it was published without any form of public consultation, which I think would have helped EU decision makers adjust proposals in a way that is, better suited to the actual needs of EU businesses and investors. So that's the first point. Then on the European Parliament position and potentially what they could end up with, same, I won't comment on potential agreements before we have actually, a clear idea of what's being proposed. From my recollection, the option of the EPP plus, conservatives and far right were basically removing climate transition plans from the CS triple D altogether, which would be a clear issue for us. And similarly with the scope of CSRD, which would be even more restricted, would, in our opinion, create some important issues in terms of ESG data gap. And now for the question on data and how to distinguish information for investing purposes and reporting purposes, that's the entire issue of the value chain gap, actually. Practically, it's very difficult to distinguish. You can ask information that could be used for both purposes. And so you could end up in a situation where either you give the possibility for the investee company to not provide the information. More realistically, as Jorgen also mentioned, they will still keep sharing this information. But then what's the point of having a value chain cap that brings, regulatory uncertainty to begin with? So that's our perspective on the question.
Yeah, just a few words on this. I do agree with the vision of my colleagues here. Specifically on the value chain cap, I think it's very important here that the answer is that it's not fit for purpose, at least from the companies' perspectives. Because if we ask them to comply with the standards, that is not enough for their investors, for their bank's requests. So what's the purpose for that? That's what. So in two words, we don't think that the VSME now, for as it is now, is fit for purpose. But Mr. Pierre, I think that I do agree with all the visions from the question number one, let's say.
I don't see anybody. Jorgen, let me ask you this. I mean, what look, you're Hydro, and for my sins, I've known Hydro for a very long time, way long. So you represent a big company, Norwegian. I mean, Norwegian are nice people, nice green people. We know that. But nevertheless, do you think there's something that would differentiate the point of view of Hydro from others that may not be as supportive? Again, I don't ask you to speak for those because that's not your job, and neither is my job. But I'm trying to at least get a conversation going, as you may see desperately. Is there what would be the concern that would make them different? Because the only thing that I would think of, and this is me speculating now, is that if I'm a European Union, not a European Union, like a union in the European Union, I would want to have this because that provides a level playing field, and I don't have to compete with a bunch of guys that don't have any rules, and there's child labor, this, that, and the other thing. Understood that. If you are a European company that has to submit to German law or French law, then by God, I mean, if I'm competing with some guys in I wouldn't say other countries that have a lot of aluminum, that may not be as concerned about some of the items that are covered by the CS legislation. Of course, I would like to have that. But there's a bunch of people that obviously have concerns. Most of the concern that I heard of is the fact that you're basically forcing people to have transition plans when they are not in countries that have transition plans. And that's kind of the one argument I have heard. I'm not, again, I read about it in the FT, to tell you the truth. Nobody told me that. But what's your view? I mean, you live, you know, I kibitz and I'm around the corporate community, but you are part of the corporate community, so they're your peers in a way.
Yeah. No, well, it's a complicated question. So first, thanks for those kind words about Norwegian. I think I have to disappoint you. I think there are nice Norwegians, but there are also less nice Norwegians, and in general,
all the ones I know are very nice.
yeah, but you pick your friends carefully. Probably a very good due diligence, risk-based approach on that one, right? No, it's a good question, right? And I'm not going to pretend that I have the whole answer. And I mean, don't get me wrong, you know, obviously there are probably good reasons for being skeptical to any kind of introduction on friction on, you know, the commercial process, right? Because whatever you introduce, it adds complexity. Yeah. But at the same time, if at least from where we sit, if we take a step backwards, and you know, what is the purpose of some of these suggested initiatives from the EU and elsewhere, right? Well, they're addressing real problems, real challenges that, you know, we face as a global community, not only the EU. And of course, by the end of the day, if there is this notion that within the EU and, you know, in broader terms, also maybe Norway and other places, we have some sort of more sustainable way of doing things. Well, it sort of begs the question, if you don't know where you're sourcing from, and if you don't know that the process back to the mine, or, you know, the tier X is more or less in accordance with, you know, general environmental and social regulations or expectations, how can you then claim that you're selling something that's sustainable? How can you claim that you sort of are competing on a different field? So you need to know these things. Anyway, and I can only speak for the aluminum value chain, but of course, when we look around at our peers, the data you're asking for and the due diligence processes you have in place or requirements, because they're on a process level, right? They're not on a, you know, a little bit black and white. They're not on a result level. They're on, you know, do you have a process in place? Do you know about the risks and the impacts? And especially in the supply chain, which is probably the most challenging part for all of us, the toolkit within the UNGP is pretty flexible, right? But there's something about forcing everybody, including the end consumer, also to understand the complexity of these things. There is a reason why we don't have mines in Europe, or very few of them. It's a big and dirty business, right? But that doesn't mean that, you know, by outsourcing the mining activities, you know, to other countries, we're effectively adding some sort of, you know, footprint in that environment that probably we should try to do something about. And, you know, knowing about these challenges all the way up to the end consumer is a step in the right direction, right? Because it comes with a cost. And obviously for aluminum, which I know, well, we have one mine, right? It's the size of Oslo. It's the size of Brussels, you know, more or less in you know, square meters. Obviously that has a huge impact, but a mine is a mine. Anything you have in your room is probably coming from a mine somewhere, a combination of mines or refineries or whatever, right? So the impact is there. I think we need to look at it and work with it. And in terms of the data, again, if you have a materiality or double materiality principle that is effective, I'm pretty sure most of the big companies already have many of these data. You know, you argue a little bit about, you know, trying to capture some of these bits and pieces. I mean, you can agree that a topic is material, but you can still disagree that the indicator you have to answer to is material, if you understand what I mean, right? So, you know, climate change, just to give an example, obviously is material for a lot of industrial companies. Doesn't mean we need to report on all of the bits and pieces because, you know, it could be a lot of work for less information. Those are two different questions, and you can say that for all the indicators. And it's the same thing with the due diligence process, which, you know, again, I'd be very, very surprised if not most of the big companies have many of these bits and pieces in place already. This is also from a commercial perspective and security of supply and all of these bits and pieces. So it's not so much a question of knowing where you source from, because we know, right? The data is also publicly available in terms of, you know, databases tracking the flows of all metal and, you know, all alloys and all of these types of things. We know 90% comes from China, period. Right. So if 90% comes from China, 90% of what you have of alloys, for example, in aluminum, well, then 90% of the aluminum that you have in the EU have their alloys from China. Right. And then it's more a question of finding out where the mines are, the magnesium mines, or, you know, the magnesium refinery, the silicon mines, et cetera, et cetera. But we know it's in China. Right. There are only so many bauxite mines in the world. So all the aluminum you have comes from one of these bauxite mines. Effectively, in Europe, I would say there's 20 mines providing you with the aluminum that you have. Much of it you get indirectly through China. We know, everybody knows. And China sources it from Guinea. So, in your cars, you have Guinea bauxite, period. We know these things. And then, it's more a question, how can we work with changing that? As long as we have a degree of flexibility in that, it's not like if you source from this place, you have to do A, B, and C, because that's a different question. But at the very least, you should know, and you should start addressing the big issues in a way that is transparent. I don't think that's a big problem for many companies. And to tell you the truth, we've been asked this long before the CSDDD from our end customers, because they want to have a sustainability claim to their customers, right? So typically what they do then is turn around. They don't go to their tier one, which is, your semi-high-tech, process company in Europe or in the EU. They come to us because we have the mine and refining data, which is, 80 to 85% of the footprint is there. Once it leaves our smelter gates in Norway, basically nothing changes. You add incremental small environmental and social footprints after that. Most of it is already done. And again, this is aluminum, could be different for other types of commodities or rare metals or whatever, but I doubt it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I fail to see that we can, as Hydro, and again, we come from a point. We have there's a legal requirement to have a climate transition plan already, but it's also something we use in the marketplace, right? And as far as I understand, the revised propositions, at least in the CSDDD, the CSRD is technically a different entity in Hydro looking at that, but of course we communicate. It's fairly watered out in terms of implementation, so you don't really have to manage to do it, but you need to have a realistic plan, right? We have a tighter process in Norway. We are subject to a much tighter scheme on that one, so we also have to have, showcase and have a year-by-year traction in terms of do we actually reach the goal towards 2030 and then 2050 after that. But for many other companies, in terms of, just as an ad hoc, we need technology to succeed. You cannot produce aluminum the way we do today at net zero without technology improvements, and we don't have them.
You guys have operations. Look, I will tell you a thing, Jürgen. This in about 1999, 2000, I used to work in UNDP New York on the Global Compact, and there was a company that doesn't exist anymore. A Norwegian oil company is called something else now, but in the old days it had the name of Statoil. Telenor was there. There were a number of companies. So I choose my friend carefully, but I know a few Norwegians in my career. But look, do you have operation in North America? I mean, I know Canada has a lot of aluminum. There's Alcoa in the States, but I don't know if you have operation in the States. Do you hear anything from your folks in the States as to what is the reaction?
Yeah, Statoil is now Equinor, and Equinor, we used to have oil and energy in Hydro too, but we divested it into Equinor, so we have an oil and energy past as well. We're the biggest extruder in North America. We have 7,000 employees spread across the 48 continental or consecutive states. So we absolutely have a lot of experience. I can't go into details on that one. Suffice it to say that we have a little bit more interaction with our legal teams in Chicago than we used to have. But the message from our customers, including Tesla, is that they want aluminum that is sourced not green only. I mean, green is a necessary condition, but it needs to be sourced green in the right way, aka what are you doing on your social and local community effects that you have across your mines and refineries, especially in Brazil, obviously, where we operate. If that answers your question.
I was just curious what was the reaction. Anyway, I'm not trying to press you. I know these are, as I mentioned, these are very sensitive things and obviously have legal ramifications. So I'm not pressing you on that at all. Look, I'm looking around and trying to see if there's anyone else that has there's a lady there. If you want to tell us who you are.
Doesn't matter. So yeah, So Eva Tarot from Teneo, and I'm just curious, I guess for any of the panelists that would take it, how do you think that the directives would affect EU's attractiveness for foreign investments, especially considering the pressure by the US and Qatar?
What organization are you from?
Teneo. Consultancy.
Could you repeat the question? How will the directives affect, and I missed the last part.
Attractiveness of the EU for foreign investments, considering the US Qatar statements?
Yeah, I can take a first crack at that. I think we would obviously need to know what comes out of the agreements at the end of the trilogue. So again, this is a bit more on the hypothetical front based on some of the directions we see in the different proposals. Coming back to a point I was making earlier, I do think that the advantages that we have right now that do differentiate the EU, our businesses, compared to what might be found elsewhere in globally, and especially in North America at the moment, is the fact that we have stringent standards on sustainability, that we have now, as of today, of course, also targets that show that there's a long-term commitment for decarbonization, and that this creates a level of certainty, right? I was just incidentally in another Chatham House discussion a few days ago, and the people were very clear that they have their work with investors who have taken big bets on environmental sustainability, and they would really have a huge problem if there was anything that indicated that there was a backtracking on that, to a point made earlier. So if we look at that, I think the advantages that we can lean into is very much around the safe haven, right? That this is still something that we keep in line in our objectives, and that for those who do feel that they will be exposed either because they have clients or they have ultimately levels of accountability that would require them to invest in and to pick businesses that have high standards and will follow high goals themselves, either expressed through transition plans or through other means for decarbonization. I think this is what is going to help us lean into our competitiveness for the economy of tomorrow. I think letting go of that, to start diversifying under pressure from foreign interests to get access to, for example, certain types of fossil fuels, right? As the EU had to compromise on in the trade agreement with the US. I think that's not sending signals that this is either a confident jurisdiction that has faith in its own transition and its own strengths, but actually it's a reactive one that's starting to buckle under a wrong assessment of what is going to create its own strength going forward. So to come back directly to your question, what is the impact of maybe the changes in CSRD and CSDDD? I think my colleagues have also mentioned that if you look at the process, I think it's been raising a lot of questions around what interests are being listened to. Is this really aligning with some of what's being asked from businesses, large and small? And I think it could be one crack in that can start many others in the perception that this is going to be jurisdiction that holds its ground, and that is going to be one of policy stability, and that can hurt us. So I mentioned as a final point earlier that we're starting to see the impact of this in the US. The backtracking is leading to people pulling out funds from green funds from the US, placing them in Europe and in Asia. But this could become a bigger problem if there is a wider kind of question mark around commitments and about resources and infrastructures that people can expect through a long-term commitment to the transition. And in a very different survey that we ran in the spring, also using an independent pollster, we found that actually 97% of business leaders from 15 different countries, including Trump, US, were saying that they would support a transition to renewable energy just to also mitigate any disruptions to supply. And over half of them said they would relocate their operations and also relocate their supply chains to areas that have more easier access to renewable energy within the next 5 years. This isn't not 10 years or whatever. This is actually within the next 5 years. So if we want to capitalize on that appetite, I think we should hold the ground and do whatever we can to signal in a meaningful way that this is not a place that's going to either create such shakeups that we're going to be seeing major confusion, major backtracking, but that we are also listening in a meaningful way to businesses. And when they say that they need certainty as well as simplification, that's what we should give them.
So you think that people are listening to the wrong people or listening to shadows, or what is it? Because I mean, from your surveys, which seem to be quite extensive, you getting some message, but there's obviously something else happening.
I mean, I think that is the biggest, maybe the main question, right? I mean, what is happening? Why are we seeing a different type of debate in Brussels, but also dominating some of the media than what in effect are the matters that businesses seem to be caring for? And ours is one of several different studies, and they tend to corroborate each other. So I do think it shows to the robustness of the findings. If I were to really broadly speculate, right, I would think that there is some level of sort of selective muting and amplification that's going on. And I think part of this could be that that simplification is an area that because it's about changing European rules, that perhaps we feel we have more control over as a way to signal that we're taking the future of Europe seriously. And that could be a good idea if we were doing the right things to get that political signaling. Because of the level of compromises we're looking at, in effect, this just looks like a reaction to signals and to the different models that are being adopted in maybe different jurisdictions, as opposed to really a European-led agenda. And I think that's that's quite a big shame. Who's speaking loudest? I mean, I will leave that up to all of us to reflect on. I think we are seeing a direct pressure from across the Atlantic. I do want to ask all of us, do we think that by giving into that, we're going to be preserving European interests, given what we know about the administration in place in the US at the moment? I think we have an answer there. So while I can't tell you who is speaking loudest, I think clearly there are those whose voices are being amplified. To what end, and is there a way that we can actually deliver a workable compromise from all of this going forward? I think we will see a bit of an indication of that once there's the new compromise from Parliament.
Yes, I think that a point that can be mentioned when it comes to extraterritoriality is also how this CSRD and CSCTD will interact or will collide with some international principles. For example, the principle of sovereignty under the UN Charter, or the principle of common and differentiated responsibilities under the Paris Agreement. So I would like to hear maybe your views on that, and also the views of someone else in the room.
I would like to get also people in the room to react. I'm desperately trying. I'm not succeeding very well, but I'm trying, because I think Yuri has been carrying the weight here, which I'm very grateful for. But well, if nobody else, Yuri, you wanna take this, Patricia?
It's not actually my yes, please.
So on sovereignty, I think we were in a really interesting moment where we're starting to see hard politics come up in a way that we haven't for many decades, in both the balance of power in diplomacy, but also specifically when it comes to working through and with the arsenal of legislation that each jurisdiction has. I think there is a valid point in making sure that we consider the coherence of the CSDDD with other considerations and requirements in international law. I think, however, and this is not, please don't take this as me advocating for one thing or the other. If I were to work through some of the logic behind some of the critique of the CSDDD from outside the EU on the basis of sovereignty, I think we have seen very, how to say, extraterritorial measures being taken by many different jurisdictions in ways that are a lot more blatant than potentially CSDDD. I'm not saying this negates any concerns with CSDDD, but I ask the question, so why is it a problem with the EU, but it's a tool that others can deploy, including in the US, right? So I think if we're talking about it just from a principle perspective, I do think we need to nuance some of these discussions with an understanding of why is this point being made now, by whom, in the current context, because again, it is to the very early point Andre made, a highly political discussion. And then have on the backdrop of that, well, what do we take back? Because this, the discussion around the EU using its tools as a kind of arm of diplomacy, either through CBAM or through other means. It's not strictly speaking just to CSDD, but then again, that's the flip side of also being what used to be the Brussels effect, right? And leading through regulation, and that can lift up, but it can also have some consideration. So I think if we look at it from a narrow sense right now in the current geopolitical dimensions, I'm not saying this is one way or the other that we should go, but I am wanting to articulate here the kind of trade-off and the kind of self-interest that comes up in these debates, and are they coherent from those who make that statement and those who are being requested to comply with them? So again, a bit more on the higher level, but I do think it's a backdrop to those questions of international law.
Anyone else? Because I don't want to prolong this if there are no other reactions in the room or on the screen. It looks like most people in this room are in agreement that these are important pieces of legislation that should be maintained largely and broadly. There are others that seem to have different views, but at least they're not present in this debate. And I'm looking for other commentaries or questions or reactions. If there are none, what I'll do is oh, there's one. My God, there's one. There's a live one. Jean-Thomas Hirsch, whom okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Jean-Thomas.
Good afternoon, Jean-Thomas Hirsch, ExxonMobil. Andre, you wanted to have some live audience and people maybe that disagree. I think this audience probably knows our corporate position on CS3D in particular, because we've been quite explicit about it and highlighting the issues we see. But I wanted to, I was reflecting on the survey, that was that I looked at the document. The question is actually, what is the greatest area, the area that is there the need for the greatest political action? So it's a bit different, and you put on the same place energy and simplification. I think everybody can understand that the energy bill is very superior to some of the administrative burden that those regulations will drive. And putting those two on the same priority for when you are in business and you prioritize, of course, people put energy price before some of the administrative. So I was wondering, we have seen many business association, BDI, MEDEF, Coffee Industry, Business Europe, representing hundreds of thousands of companies, and they are all asking for simplification. Why would we think that a survey of 2,500 companies is more representative than business association that represent hundreds of thousands of companies? So that's my first question. You know, why do you think your survey is more representative? The second is, I hear from you, derive from the survey that this is helpful for the business. I mean, nobody prevents people to do something that is helpful of their business. The question is, should it be mandatory? If you think this is helpful, yeah, sure, you can do it. If you think for your company adopting a transition plan is helpful, yes, sure, do it. Why does Europe think that it's needed to mandate something that is helpful? If it's helpful, people do things that are helpful for themselves, and companies do take measures that are helpful for themselves. We do tons of due diligence today as a company. We don't need to be mandated. We do it because it's the right thing to do. The problem is the mandate. Why do you think that mandating thing is helpful? So that's my second question. And I hope I spark a little bit the debate. Thanks, Andre.
Well, by God, I hope so. No, I mean, I think that's talking about different levels of conversation. So you have a level of conversation about, I would say, provisions, specific provisions in this legislation, but then you have a different level of conversation about, in general, the principles. And I think Jean-Thomas, interpreting what he said, and be interesting also to hear from now you're talking. Jorgen as well, is why is the state have to mandate this? If I don't want to, the question, the way I interpret it is if I don't have a plan and nobody will invest in me, then I have a problem, and then I'm going to have to make one, or I'm going to go out of business, or I know something that other people don't know. That's kind of a more high-level question, but I think that you probably, I'm looking at you, you probably can't resist answering that. And it's actually, as in the UN, it will say, you've been addressed directly, so I have to give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jean-Thomas, for sparking the debate indeed, and obviously invitation to my colleagues here too, if they want to come in, since I don't want to hog the mic. I think starting with the second question, if it's so important, it should be voluntary, right? Like, why should it be mandatory? If there's a logic behind it, people will do it anyway. I think I would sort of beg the kind of question in return, which is, well, if there are costs associated with getting the systems up in the first place, right? And if there is a question of a level playing field, and if there's then a question of there are derivatives of the benefits that come with that, will everybody do it, right? And I think it's also a question of creating the tools and the practices that will then elevate some of the information, some of the tools in the market. And I think just hoping that voluntary measures will do that. I'm sure that there's a logic there that holds to one extent, but is that really going to speed up the action we need in the time frame that we're working on? Because if we had endless time, I think I would say let's see voluntary measures play out when they need to. But we're talking about a climate transition with very tight investment needs across a certain number of years ahead. I think we do need to be looking at approaches that both incentivize, but also then allow people to derive the benefits from those approaches. So I think just making the debate about, well, it's so important that people will decide to do it anyway, does miss an understanding of how companies, how practices end up being adopted and deployed in the first place, and creating that enabling framework for these things to be to carry out in the first place. And of course, looking at Beatrice and Piero, if you want to reply on that. Now, on just the bit around the business associations versus surveys, I think here this is about the plurality of views, right? It's where it's not to say one survey is better than the view, an opinion submitted by one business association. But I think one thing that we were talking about earlier is that there's a bit of an alarming lack of counter views from a wide range of businesses that seem to be just going through business associations, but clearly there is some plurality on the ground. So how can we get that in there? How do we actually help that debate become a debate and not what it seems sometimes, which is some big voices with projection power within Brussels and in member states from having some demands that they believe to be legitimate, but may not, obviously, may miss out the hundreds of thousands of other businesses that are not part of their association. So I think in the spirit of also making sure that we're looking at two parts of a picture and not just saying that one survey is not, representative, or that business associations trump out other forms of getting views into the debate, would be, I think, to our detriment, missing a larger point on getting the actual nuances into the debate that we very much need.
Yes, sorry. Can I have just two words? Because I would like to stress the ECB and supervisory authorities' views on that. So for me, when we talk about mandate transition plans, mandate data collection, is a matter of opportunities, and Jure touched upon that very, very well, but is a matter, first of all, of risks, okay? So the ECB, that is a non-political institution here in Europe, primary mandate for the ECB is to secure the financial stability. And from, I don't know how many years ago, they started doing the stress test, okay? And they recognize that we have a risk, a concrete risks connected to climate change impacts. And if they have to manage, okay, this economic and financial risk associated to climate, they have also to ask their supervisory authorities, so central banks of member states, and as a consequence, our banks, our investors, our financial entities in general, to mitigate, to manage this risk. And the way to manage this is, first of all, having data, and second of all, developing climate transition plans, developing decarbonization strategies. So that's why I think that should be mandated. Okay, but I mean, the point is managing climate-related risks for me.
Let me ask you a question, because I come from carbon markets. So if you have a cap, what else do you need?
You have a what, sorry?
You have a cap in the ETS. All these people have a cap. If they have a cap, what else do you need? I mean, unless you tell them that they can't manage their business. I mean, no, but seriously speaking, I mean, do you answer that?
Yeah.
No, maybe just to spark on top of this, no? Yes, carbon markets do work mostly, and you have a cap. Unless then you negotiate that the cap should be moved or delayed or so on. Like it's a news from this morning, right? But part of the conclusions of the council is to delay the phase out of allowances in the ETS. So yes, there is a market. Yes, we have a cap, but also we see pushes from left and right to loosen those rules. And so I don't know, but maybe we need other instruments, because markets alone are not delivering, and then companies need delays on what the market should be giving. And then politics might shift, as it is right now, and then you get different conclusions. And so the market alone doesn't deliver it.
Have the climate law. Boy, I mean, we're coming to the end and people are coming alive. I like this.
Hello, Susanna Ruth from Frank Bolt. I wanted to add as well with regards to mandating or voluntary. Frank Bolt, we've been doing studies for the past 5-7 years about the sustainability information that companies have been providing in the European market. We also have to remember that the development of this law comes from 2013, 2014, so it's been a decade in the making. There were several studies, scientific evidence that said that we needed standardization, that we needed some mandatory rules, precisely to protect the leaders and to kind of like move the laggards and move the market to like provide this information and do it in a way that is usable, that is pragmatic. That's what we try to achieve with the CSRD and with the ESRSs. We were also kind of like some of the first ones to say, okay, we may see some issues with over-implementation. There are issues that are taking place within companies and auditors. Let's examine those. Let's find solutions. But a journey that took 10 years suddenly just took 6 months to like have on the table some proposals that were not discussed, that didn't kind of get enough input, enough testing. There were solutions that many people within institutions, within supervisory authorities were valuing as more reasonable, that didn't get a chance to get discussed. So that's where we are right now. So we have this year seen the positive effect of the first year of implementation of the CSRD. We're hearing the same message that Jürgen just shared before. It's about data that companies already have. We're just presenting it in a different manner, something that is easily read, understood, compared. That was the main purpose of the CSRD. Now we had a level 2, we had the standards, we are going through simplifications. There are many ways. However, going back to one of the questions that were put before, just playing with numbers in a way that seems like playing bingo, like we are using numbers for a scope here and there. This is not reasonable policymaking. This does not respect actually those companies that have been doing this work, that are implementing due diligence, that are implementing reporting. So there are solutions that are technically, we can discuss it, we can sit on the table. We've been asking for years, companies, please tell us what's too complicated. Please tell us where you have the issues, and let's solve those. But you need to sit on the tables and have these discussions. However, the criticisms and those that have been taking the phone and kind of like having big influence and kind of like what are the changes that have been proposed have gone an entire different way that really do not provide and do not ease kind of like the life of like big companies, and not facilitate the creation of an infrastructure that provides information easily to all stakeholders, to clients. So there are solutions on the tables, but people that are interested in just like simplifying should sit and actually negotiate in good faith instead of just taking numbers and playing with rules and providing this uncertainty to companies that are already doing that. So again, it's the point about we are just making sure that we are providing this level playing field. This is something that I believe like many of the speakers have given. And again, I reiterate, we've been asking for years. If there are issues, please tell us where, and let's do something about it. If there are inconsistencies, if there are duplications, we can work on that. And you can have a lot of people, you can find a lot of people in the Commission, in EFRAG, in supervisory authorities that are ready to do that. So it's engaging in good faith and not playing with the rules.
I will submit something else because I'm trying to, maybe Jean-Thomas or others would speak, but what I heard, at least from Jean-Thomas, and this is my words, not his words, but what I heard from him is not an argument about what you said, that, you know, the duplication or not duplication or points of information or whatever. It's a matter of principle. Why should I do this? Why does the state have to force me to do this? So I think we have two different conversations here. One of them is, some of you seem to kind of think that the state has a role to do this. There are obviously some other people who think that that is not the place. But again, I'm just trying to get the discussion going if I can in some way. But we're also coming, you know, like when you go to the shrink, you sit on a sofa and they say, but your hour is up. So the hour is kind of up. So I wanted to go just backwards, if you want, and get some final conclusions. I think I didn't want to go back to Jorgen because I feel that there are obviously areas that, you know, that are sensitive, and I don't want to push into areas that are sensitive. But any thoughts, anything that you would want to take from this conversation, Jorgen? I think that obviously your company has a long history in supporting these initiatives, and obviously you are supportive of this initiative. But is any final comments in this session, because there will be other discussion, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's important. Of course, we understand that this is, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, if it wasn't complicated, we wouldn't have this discussion. And I think we have to respect that. And in terms of the input from Exxon, was it, or Chevron? I forgot. You know, let's be mindful of the fact that we come from different positions and places, right? But it's not an either or in my world. And there's something about sustainability reporting, for example. I mean, you know, basically what it's trying to do is to capture information that's helpful for stakeholders, right? And in a perfect world, that would be voluntarily. But I mean, we tried voluntarily, it doesn't work. And you can, you know, that sort of begs the question, why do we have any laws? If people were nice, they would fix things. But, you know, we don't. And I look at myself in the mirror, I also need laws from time to time, even though I'm a Norwegian. Of course, we want to have as few laws as possible, but I'm pretty sure on sustainability reporting and on due diligence, it doesn't work if we don't have some rules that are common, because that has been tried and tested and we fail. Okay. Having said that, we should keep it as basic as possible, right? So, I mean, I'm not going to go into details on climate transition plans. You know, obviously that is more challenging for oil and energy in one way, but at the same time, just to give you a heads up on that one, our refinery alone has more CO2 emission than Iceland. So you're not the only one dealing with challenges related to CO2 emissions. And to the best of my knowledge, Equinor has a fairly robust climate transition plan. Of course, you are in a different position, but you know, it's possible to do it. You know? So the market, I think everybody knows the market is a great thing, but sometimes it has unwanted consequences. And in terms of reporting, you know, I'm not going to go into details. I, for one, think some bits and pieces of the CRD are strange. I freely acknowledge that. But the point of providing useful information on material topics obviously is important. Because if you don't measure, you're basically saying, I don't manage. And if I don't manage, I can't change things. So if you don't have data on something, you can't really claim it's important. Because if there's one thing I know for companies is that anything that's important, you have data on them, and you have data that you can make decisions out of. So that principle should be firm, and then you can discuss the details. And I agree with what's been said in terms of, you know, leaving a bit of flexibility, both on the CS3D and on the CSRD for the company. That's important because, you know, reporting fatigue is an element. But I think, you know, the Omnibus proposals takes away a lot of the sting in terms of the over-reporting burden for many elements. And companies usually are lazy. And if we're bold at the same time, I'm pretty sure we can say that this topic is material, but we're not going to report on this indicator because it's too much work. It gives you a little more assurance. So we'd rather use this data instead. You're still addressing the topic. So like I said before, I think we shouldn't just look at where we have discrepancies, but also where we share a common purpose. And like you said, has been said not only by me, the big companies have due diligence process in place. Okay, let's start there. It's usually risk-based because we want to do as little as possible if we can. But we have to be open and transparent about some of the results and details, because that forces us to sort of actually do more sometimes. I guess that's where we sit.
Thank you, Jürgen. So I think the point you're making is you can't manage until you measure. Let's go down the list. Yuri, I think you, well, I have a list here. And then we go to Pierre and then to Beatrice.
Yeah, I think, well, thank you for the discussion and for the questions, and what did end up being a debate. I think it is important to articulate some of what we think are some of the inconsistencies, some of the areas where opportunity is turning into potentially a risk and a negative consequence in the omnibus process, as many have said here. I think the core aim and the direction of just making it work better and making life easier for companies is a noble one, and we do need to keep that in view. But I do worry about some of the unintended consequences of the process as it's been conducted to date with the proposals we have right now. And I do hope in the trilogues we will of course see what comes out of the European Parliament compromise. I'm starting to see some news come in of speculation of what might happen on the 13th next week. But I do think this is an opportunity to both send a signal for companies. I think, of course, this is Omnibus 1. There are other omnibuses to come. So it's not just a process that's being conducted in a vacuum. I think for all the points that I mentioned earlier, we want to be sending the signals of confidence, and that this is an area where we can compete in ways that are meaningful with global competitors. And to the colleague from Frank Bold's point earlier about the building a data infrastructure, I mean, this is our opportunity to shine on sustainability data, right? Right now, we purchase so many proxy data from the US. We're really talking about trying to bring some ownership back. This is one way we can do it. But I'll stop here. Thank you for the discussion.
Thank you, Yuri. Pierre?
Yeah, I'll be relatively brief because I think we touched upon a lot of the different topics today, and I support most of what this panel has said. I think these rules are really key to establish these baseline requirements and these possibility to compare different companies and their performance as well. So as such, they are essential to maintain for investors. One word that I would like to insist on is also consistency. At the European level, we have major strategic objectives, which are decarbonization, which are achieving the objective of the Clean Industrial Deal. And we also have the objective of the Savings and Investment Union, which is to mobilize capital and to redirect towards our industry. The Omnibus initiative may take away the tools that investors need to do that. So let's keep in mind all of the stakeholders' needs as well, and make sure that sustainability data remains available for sustainability-oriented investors.
And finally, last but not least.
I would like to close going back to the beginning, actually, because I think that we enter and we discuss a lot of very important technicalities of these two main directives, but I think that during this whole year of discussion and negotiation around the Omnibus, we forgot about why we have these two directives first in place. The first reason for me is that with the Green Deal, the European Commission, Europe in general, defined what was our competitive advantage, and we are losing it. Our competitive advantage was the green, was the sustainability. And those directives was actually aimed for that, to pursue this competitive advantage that we created. And I heard a lot about creating our playing field. That was the reason behind CSRD and CSDDD. And the second is about risks. Again, we have identified a climate-related financial and economic risks that can be managed they have to be managed as another economic and finance risks. Okay, there's no difference among that. I was talking with Elderson one day, and he was going to the governor of Bank of Italy saying, "You have identified climate as one of your material risks, so you have to manage it." as all the others. Okay, so it's not a matter of voluntary or not voluntary. You have to deal with your own risks that you have identified. It's material. You have to manage it, and the way to manage it is starting from data, CS-DD, transition plan, and so on and so forth. So competitive advantage for me and risks. Nicholas here.
Well, since you opened the door and said that we're going back to where we started, I personally will go to Brazil, and I started this in '92 in Rio at the conference on trade and development, from which the desertification and biodiversity and framework convention on climate change came, and sustainable development. I don't go back as far as the Brundtland Commission, but I do go back as Rio '92, where sustainability comes from. So this is something that we go full circle, and it's time to reflect. Also, it's a time to reflect where we are in terms of both the climate crisis, but also the economic situation of the EU. But two things that I wanted to say is that this is clearly, and maybe people don't like to hear this, but it's clearly a discussion on two different levels. One of them, people talk about simplification. I don't know what simplification means. Simplification is something pretty simple. You avoid duplication. You make something that is too complicated less complex, understandable. You read like you buy your TV. You can't figure out what you read in that book because it's very complicated. Somebody should simplify that. But by and large, there's not a lot of simplification. I mean, let's be blunt about it. There's not about a lot of simplification. It's simply a discussion that is about simplification. There are some elements of it. But there's also philosophical discussion and different points of view. And some companies, some countries have a view on things, and other countries have different views on things. And I think this is where we're beginning to get into a point where we're starting to clash. We in coming from Rio and setting up all these institutions, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, whatever it may have been in those days, Schmidt-Heine from Wholesome. All these were heroic days, but in those days, business was all sold together because it sounded like a great idea. And now coming in 2025, it's become a very competitive issue. And whether you like it or not, it is very much about competition. And yes, I mean, it looks like Exxon kind of got the courage to speak up. I think it was Exxon. I'm not sure whether Chevron or Exxon, but I think it was Exxon. Got their courage up to speak, but whether they have a mandate to speak up, but others don't want to do that. There's clearly something going on, and I think that the sooner we solve it in one way or another, the better off we are, because these are important things about investment. It's about predictability. It's about moving ahead together, because only together we can make this continent continues to be prosperous. Now, we will continue to monitor this, as I'm sure most of you, all of you will continue to monitor probably in more detail. Many of you are what I would call more into the lobbying business. We're in the think tank business, so we're not as close to the day-to-day and the EPP and the ECR. We just not the kind of stuff that we do. These are political lobbying, political information that people do. But we will be present, and we will continue to analyze and monitor, and hope that you will join us for further discussion. So thanking to Jorgen. Jorgen, you are not here with us, but in spirit, you are on the screen, and we appreciate your taking the time. As always, coming from, you may not like this, but coming from Hydro, always very clear views and very well expressed, and I appreciate that. And I'm not being patronizing. I just know a lot of Hydro people. Also the others, that Yuri and Pierre and Beatrice, thank you very much all for taking the time to joining us, and to Chiara for the work that she's doing together with the rest of the team in ERCST. And we hope that next time we will have more of a debate. We'll try and get more people in the room that are willing to speak up, because I think it's to our all advantage. If we all agree to each other, there's not much of a debate, but obviously we do need to have a debate. So all, thank you very much, and we'll see you guys next time. Thank you.